At 10:01 a.m. on December 15, 1944, Private First Class Dirk Vlug crouched behind a fallen mahogany log on the Ormoc-Lyman Road in the Philippines, watching 5 Japanese tanks rumble toward his roadblock through the morning mist. The 24-year-old machinist from Michigan had been manning this choke point for 8 days, armed with a 12-pound bazooka and 6 rockets, believing what every infantry manual taught him, that small teams with anti-tank weapons could hold any road if they stayed in cover and picked their shots carefully. The roadblock was supposed to stop Japanese reinforcements moving inland from Ormoc Bay, but nobody expected armor. His battalion commander had positioned 3 squads here because the terrain was perfect. Steep embankments on both sides, thick jungle, a narrow road where tanks would have to advance single file like sitting ducks. Standard doctrine said to let them come close, fire from concealment, fall back if overwhelmed. Vlug had loaded his first rocket and was settling into his covered position when the lead tank's 37mm gun swiveled toward his log. The machine gun fire started, long bursts raking the roadblock, splintering wood, sending his squad diving for deeper cover. Every manual, every training exercise, every veteran who'd survived tank encounters had drilled the same lesson into his head. Never leave cover, never advance alone, never engage multiple tanks without support. But as the first Type 95 Hago tank rolled closer, its thin armor gleaming in the jungle light, its crew confident they were facing scattered infantry, Vlug made a decision that defied everything he'd been taught. He stood up, stepped out from behind his log, and walked straight toward 5 enemy tanks with nothing but a bazooka and an impossible idea. What happened in the next 30 minutes would prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what the enemy never expects you to do. The roadblock had been quiet for 3 hours when Vlug heard the first engine. It was 7:47 a.m., and the sound drifted through the jungle like distant thunder, low, mechanical, definitely not American. He shifted behind the mahogany log that served as his primary firing position, checking the sight picture down the Ormoc-Lyman Road toward the curve, where it disappeared into dense foliage. The 6-rocket loadout for his bazooka sat arranged in a neat row beside him, each 2.36-inch warhead capable of penetrating 3 to 4 inches of steel armor. His squad leader, Sergeant Martinez, had positioned the other men in a shallow arc covering the road, but their primary weapons were rifles and one .30 caliber machine gun. Against infantry, the setup was textbook. Against what was coming, it might not be enough. The Type 95 Hago tanks emerged from the jungle curve at 8:59 a.m., moving in column formation at roughly 12 miles per hour. Vlug counted 5 vehicles through his binoculars, each weighing 7.4 tons, armed with a 37mm main gun and 2 7.7mm machine guns. The lead tank's commander stood in his cupola, scanning the road ahead through field glasses. These were machines from the 1st Independent Tank Company, part of General Suzuki's reinforcement effort to hold the Ormoc corridor. Their armor was thin by 1944 standards, 12mm in front, 9mm on the sides, but their crews were experienced and their mission was clear: punch through any American roadblocks and link up with Japanese forces defending the inland positions. Vlug had studied these tanks during intelligence briefings back at battalion headquarters. The Hago design dated to 1935, originally built for operations in Manchuria against Chinese forces who lacked effective anti-tank weapons. By Pacific War standards, they were obsolete, but in jungle terrain where heavier American armor couldn't operate effectively, they remained dangerous. The 37mm gun could penetrate 2 inches of steel at 300 yards, more than enough to destroy any American light vehicle or fortification. The machine guns provided suppressive fire against infantry. Most critically, their mobility allowed them to advance where foot soldiers would bog down in mud and undergrowth. The tactical problem was immediate and complex. Doctrine called for anti-tank teams to engage from concealed positions at ranges under 150 yards, fire 1 or 2 rockets, then withdraw before return fire could locate their position. But the terrain here offered limited fallback positions. Steep embankments on both sides meant the road was essentially a bottleneck. If the tanks broke through, they would reach the battalion's main defensive line within 20 minutes, potentially collapsing the entire roadblock system that protected the American advance toward Ormoc Bay. Vlug loaded his first rocket while Martinez coordinated with the machine gun team over the field telephone. The plan was simple: let the tanks close to within 100 yards, concentrate fire on the lead vehicle, hope to disable or destroy it quickly enough to block the road for the others. The bazooka's effective range was theoretically 150 yards, but jungle conditions and the need for precise hits against moving targets meant getting closer was essential. The shape-charged warhead would punch through the Hago's thin armor easily if Vlug could achieve a perpendicular hit on the side or rear panels. At 9:58 a.m., the lead tank was at 200 yards and closing. Its commander had spotted something, possibly the glint of the machine gun barrel or movement from one of the rifle positions, because the 37mm gun began traversing toward the American positions. Vlug could hear the mechanical whining of the turret drive over the rumble of the tank's diesel engine. The second tank in column had also stopped, its commander scanning the roadside through binoculars. Radio chatter between the vehicles suggested they suspected an ambush but weren't certain of American positions or strength. The first burst of machine gun fire came at 10:01 a.m. exactly. Long, disciplined bursts from the lead tank's bow gun, raking the fallen log where Vlug had been visible moments before. Wood splinters showered around him as he pressed himself against the reverse slope of a small depression behind his position. The other tanks immediately opened fire, not at specific targets, but laying down suppressive fire across the entire roadblock area. 37mm high-explosive shells began detonating among the trees, shredding foliage and sending fragments whistling overhead. Martinez tried to coordinate return fire, but the machine gun team was pinned down by accurate fire from the second tank. The rifle positions were effectively neutralized. The men could barely lift their heads, let alone acquire targets. The Japanese tanks continued their advance during the fire exchange, moving at walking speed but steadily closing the distance. Their tactics were sound: suppress the roadblock with overwhelming firepower, advance under that suppression, then assault through with infantry support that would dismount once the armor had cleared the American positions. Vlug realized the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. From his concealed position, he could see the lead tank at 120 yards and still advancing. Its machine gun was traversing methodically, searching for targets. The crew was confident. They had faced American roadblocks before and knew that infantry rarely stood up to coordinated tank assault. The standard response was for the Americans to fire a few ineffective shots, then withdraw deeper into the jungle where armor couldn't follow. But this roadblock couldn't withdraw. The mission was to hold the Ormoc-Lyman Road and prevent Japanese reinforcement from reaching the coastal defenses. Lieutenant Colonel Bailey had made that clear during the briefing. The road junction here was critical to the entire American advance. If Japanese armor broke through and linked up with the defenders at Ormoc, the American offensive would stall, potentially for weeks. The cost in casualties from a prolonged jungle campaign would be enormous. The tactical manual said to stay in cover, coordinate with supporting elements, and engage only when victory was probable. But the manual assumed supporting elements were available and that withdrawal was an option. Here, Vlug was the supporting element. The roadblock's effectiveness depended on his ability to stop 5 tanks with 6 rockets in terrain that offered no second chances. As the lead tank closed to 100 yards, its 37mm gun swiveling toward his position, Vlug made the decision that would define the next 30 minutes. He stood up, stepped out from behind the mahogany log, and began walking toward the enemy armor with his bazooka loaded and ready. The bazooka weighed 14 pounds fully loaded, its olive drab tube extending 4 feet 4 inches from breech to muzzle. Vlug carried it at port arms as he moved toward the lead tank, the weight familiar after months of training and combat in New Guinea. The weapon's design was elegantly simple, a smooth bore tube that used the rocket's own propellant to generate velocity, with no complex mechanisms to jam or malfunction in jungle conditions. The 2.36-inch rocket nested in the tube contained a shape-charged warhead designed to focus explosive energy into a narrow jet capable of penetrating tank armor. At close range against the Hago's thin plating, it was devastating. The lead tank commander spotted Vlug's movement at 90 yards. Through his binoculars, the Japanese officer saw a single American infantryman walking directly toward his formation in broad daylight, carrying what appeared to be some kind of tube weapon. The tactical situation made no sense. Individual soldiers didn't assault tank columns alone. An American anti-tank doctrine emphasized concealment and coordinated fire. The commander barked orders to his gunner, who began traversing the 37mm gun toward this unexpected threat while the bow machine gunner adjusted his aim point. Vlug understood the ballistics precisely. The rocket would travel at roughly 285 feet per second, meaning a flight time of just over 1 second at his intended engagement range. The Hago's armor thickness varied by location: 12mm on the front glacis, 9mm on the sides, 6mm on the rear panels. His shape-charged warhead could penetrate up to 4 inches of steel, making any hit potentially lethal. The critical factor was angle of impact. A perpendicular strike would maximize penetration, while oblique hits might deflect harmlessly off the tank's sloped surfaces. At 75 yards, the tank's machine gun opened fire. Vlug heard the rounds snapping past his head, the distinctive crack thump of bullets breaking the sound barrier inches from his position. The gunner was firing short bursts, trying to walk his shots onto target rather than spraying wildly. Professional technique, but rushed under pressure. Vlug continued advancing at a steady walking pace, his breathing controlled, his grip firm on the bazooka's wooden stock and forward grip. The weapon's sight picture showed the tank growing larger through the simple aperture sight, its angular hull and turret clearly defined against the jungle background. The tactical doctrine he was violating had been written by men who understood armor warfare. Tank columns were supposed to be engaged by coordinated teams with multiple weapons, supported by artillery or airstrikes when possible. Individual. Soldiers were expected to harass armor from concealment, then withdraw to prepared positions where heavier weapons could engage effectively. What Vlug was doing, advancing alone across open ground towards superior numbers, was tactically unsound by every measure except one. It was the only action that might prevent 5 enemy tanks from breaking through the roadblock. At 60 yards, he knelt and shouldered the bazooka. The firing position was textbook. Left knee down, right foot planted, weapon cradled against his shoulder with his left hand supporting the tube and his right hand gripping the stock. The Hago's turret was traversing toward him, but the 37mm gun moved slowly under manual control. Vlug aligned his sight picture on the tank's left side panel, just below the turret ring where armor was thinnest. The range was optimal, close enough for maximum accuracy, far enough to avoid the worst effects of his own weapon's backblast. The rocket motor ignited with a sharp crack, sending a 4-foot flame shooting from the bazooka's rear. The 2.36-inch projectile streaked across the gap in 1.2 seconds, its stabilizing fins keeping it on trajectory, despite the humid air and crosswind from the jungle canopy. Impact occurred precisely where Vlug had aimed. The shaped charge detonated against the Hago's side armor, with a sharp bang that echoed through the trees. The copper liner of the warhead formed a superheated jet that punched through 9mm of steel and continued into the tank's fighting compartment at approximately 22,000 feet per second. The crew of 4 men died instantly. The driver slumped over his controls while the commander, gunner, and loader were killed by the metal jet and secondary fragments from the tank's interior. The Hago coasted forward another 20 feet before its dead driver's weight pushed the left steering lever, causing the 7-ton vehicle to veer toward the roadside embankment. Engine still running, it ground to a halt with its tracks churning uselessly in the soft earth. The second tank's crew had watched their lead vehicle destroyed by what appeared to be a single American soldier with a shoulder-fired weapon. Their tactical training had not prepared them for this scenario. Tank doctrine assumed infantry anti-tank weapons would be employed from concealment by multiple operators with coordinated fire plans. The sight of one man advancing alone toward their formation suggested either suicidal desperation or tactical innovation they hadn't encountered before. Vlug was already reloading. The bazooka's breech mechanism allowed rapid follow-up shots. He inserted his second rocket, closed the breech, and shouldered the weapon again within 15 seconds. The second Hago was accelerating toward him, its commander having decided that the best response to this unexpected threat was immediate assault. The tank's machine guns were firing continuously now, kicking up dirt around Vlug's position as he moved laterally to maintain separation from his first firing point. The crew of the second tank attempted to dismount while their vehicle was still moving. The commander and loader tumbled from the turret hatch, seeking to assault Vlug with small arms while their driver continued the advance. This was improvised tactics, not doctrine, but a reasonable response to an unprecedented threat. Vlug saw them coming and drew his .45 caliber pistol, firing 3 shots that forced both men back toward their tank. One crewman stumbled and fell, blood visible on his uniform, while the other scrambled for cover behind the Hago's hull. With the tank crew neutralized or suppressed, Vlug focused on the vehicle itself. The second Hago had closed to 45 yards and was turning to bring its main gun to bear. At this range, the 37mm gun couldn't miss. If it fired, Vlug would be dead within seconds. He aimed his second rocket at the tank's front glacis plate, knowing the 12mm armor there was still well within his weapon's penetration capability. The critical factor was timing. He needed to fire before the Hago's gun could traverse and engage. The rocket struck just below the driver's vision port. The shaped charge punched through the frontal armor and detonated inside the fighting compartment, killing the remaining crew and igniting stored ammunition. Secondary explosions rippled through the tank as 37mm rounds and machine gun belts cooked off in the intense heat. The Hago lurched to a stop, black smoke pouring from its hatches, effectively blocking the road for the 3 remaining tanks in the column. The 3 remaining Hago tanks had stopped behind the burning wreckage of their lead vehicles, their commanders reassessing a tactical situation that had deteriorated from routine roadblock clearance to something approaching catastrophe. 2 tanks destroyed in under 3 minutes by a single American infantryman challenged every assumption about Pacific Theater armor operations. The Japanese crews could see Vlug moving between positions, reloading his bazooka with practiced efficiency, apparently preparing to engage their remaining vehicles with the same direct assault tactics that had proven devastatingly effective. The 3rd tank in column began maneuvering off the road, its driver attempting to find solid ground among the trees where American anti-tank fire might be less accurate. The Hago's narrow tracks and low ground pressure allowed limited cross-country movement, but the jungle terrain severely restricted options. Thick undergrowth, fallen logs, and steep ravines channeled the tank's movement back toward the road corridor where Vlug waited with 4 rockets remaining. The tank commander understood he was trapped in a tactical bottleneck, but retreat was not an option. His orders were to break through American positions and link up with defenders at Ormoc Bay. Vlug had moved 30 yards east of his previous firing positions, using the jungle terrain to mask his movement from the enemy tanks. His tactical thinking had evolved during the engagement from defensive roadblock operations to aggressive hunter-killer tactics. The Japanese armor was constrained by terrain and the wreckage of their own vehicles, giving him temporary advantage despite being outnumbered 3-1. Each Hago represented a significant threat to his battalion's mission, but they were also predictable, limited to the road corridor, dependent on coordinated movement, vulnerable to flanking fire from concealed positions. The concentrated fire from all 3 remaining tanks began at 10:07 a.m. 37mm high-explosive shells detonated among the trees where Vlug had been visible, shredding foliage and sending fragments whistling through the air. Machine gun fire swept the roadside in overlapping beaten zones, the gunners trying to suppress any position from which anti-tank fire might come. The volume of fire was impressive, but largely ineffective. The Japanese crews were shooting at areas where they thought Vlug might be, rather than confirmed target locations. From his concealed position behind a massive buttress root, Vlug observed the enemy fire patterns and identified tactical opportunities. The tanks were firing independently rather than coordinating their suppression, leaving gaps in coverage that could be exploited by rapid movement. More critically, their ammunition expenditure was unsustainable. Each Hago carried only 40 rounds of 37mm ammunition and limited machine gun belts. If he could force them to expend ordnance without achieving decisive results, their combat effectiveness would degrade rapidly. The 3rd tank had successfully maneuvered off-road and was attempting to flank Vlug's last known position from the south. Its commander had shown tactical initiative by recognizing that direct advance down the road would result in the same fate as his 2 destroyed comrades. The flanking movement was sound doctrine, used terrain and vegetation to approach the anti-tank position from an unexpected angle, then engage with main gunfire at close range, where accuracy was virtually guaranteed. Vlug anticipated this maneuver and had positioned himself to counter it. His 3rd rocket was loaded and ready as he moved through the jungle parallel to the flanking tank's advance. The Hago's crew was focused on navigation through difficult terrain, with limited visibility through the driver's vision ports and periscopes. They couldn't see Vlug approaching from their blind side until he emerged from behind a cluster of bamboo at 60 yards range. The shape-charged warhead struck the tank's right side panel at the junction between hull and turret. Penetration was complete. The copper jet punched through armor and continued into the fighting compartment where it killed 2 crew. Members instantly and severely wounded the others. The Hago lurched to a halt, its engine still running but its combat capability eliminated. Secondary fires began spreading through the vehicle as fuel lines ruptured and ammunition heated toward detonation. The 4th tank commander had witnessed the destruction of his flanking element and made a command decision that reflected both courage and tactical desperation. Rather than continue defensive maneuvering that had proven ineffective against this unprecedented threat, he ordered maximum speed advance directly toward Vlug's position. The Hago accelerated to 15 miles per hour along the road, machine guns firing continuously, main gun traversing to engage targets of opportunity. This was assault doctrine adapted to crisis, use speed and firepower to close with the enemy before he could reload and fire again. Vlug's 4th rocket was ready as the tank closed to 50 yards. The engagement geometry was head-on, with the Hago's thickest armor, 12 millimeters on the front glasses, facing his position. But the shape-charge warhead could penetrate 4 inches of steel, making frontal armor thickness irrelevant at this range. He aimed for the driver's compartment, knowing that crew casualties would stop the vehicle even if mechanical damage was limited. The rocket struck just above the Hago's front drive sprocket. The explosion killed the driver instantly and disabled the transmission, causing the tank to veer sharply left before grinding to a halt against a mahogany tree. The impact jarred the remaining crew unconscious, effectively removing the fourth tank from combat, even though secondary damage was limited. Smoke began pouring from the engine compartment as ruptured fuel lines fed fires that would eventually consume the vehicle entirely. One tank remained operational. The fifth Hago had maintained position behind the original roadblock, its crew observing the systematic destruction of their unit with growing awareness that conventional tank tactics were inadequate against this American soldier's innovative approach. 4 tanks destroyed or disabled in 12 minutes challenged fundamental assumptions about armor superiority in jungle warfare. The remaining commander faced a tactical dilemma: continue the assault against an opponent who had demonstrated superior technique, or withdraw and report the roadblock as impregnable to American anti-tank weapons. Vlug had 2 rockets remaining and 1 target. The tactical mathematics were straightforward, but the psychological pressure was mounting. Each successful engagement had drawn him deeper into direct combat with enemy armor, escalating his risk exposure with every shot. The Japanese crew in the surviving tank would be highly motivated and increasingly desperate, making them potentially more dangerous than their destroyed comrades. Moreover, his own ammunition supply was nearly exhausted. After this engagement, he would have no anti-tank capability remaining if additional enemy vehicles appeared. The final Hago began advancing at 10:15 a.m., moving slowly and deliberately along the road toward Vlug's general position. Its commander was taking no tactical risks, keeping the main gun trained on likely firing positions while the machine gunners maintained suppressive fire against the roadside vegetation. This was professional technique under extreme pressure, methodical advance with maximum firepower, accepting slower progress in exchange for enhanced survivability. As the range closed to 70 yards, Vlug prepared for what would determine the roadblock's ultimate success or failure. 4 enemy tanks destroyed, 1 remaining, 2 rockets left. The tactical situation had evolved from defensive engagement to personal duel between one American soldier and the last representative of Japanese armored power on the Ormoc-Lyman Road. The 5th Hago's commander had learned from watching his comrades die. Instead of advancing predictably down the road or attempting cross-country flanking maneuvers, he ordered his driver to reverse position and use the wreckage of the second destroyed tank as cover. The tactical decision was sound: hull down behind the burning vehicle, only his turret exposed, maximum protection while maintaining ability to engage with the 37mm gun. From this position, he could force Vlug to approach across open ground for an effective shot, reversing the tactical advantage that had proved so lethal. Vlug recognized the changed situation immediately. His previous engagements had succeeded because Japanese crews followed predictable armor doctrine: advance to contact, suppress with firepower, assault through resistance. The surviving commander was adapting, using terrain and friendly wreckage to create a defensive strongpoint that negated American mobility advantages. The Hago's position behind the destroyed tank meant Vlug would need to maneuver for side shots while exposing himself to accurate return fire from the main gun. The machine gun fire intensified as Vlug moved between positions, trying to find an angle that would allow effective engagement without suicidal exposure. 7.7mm rounds chewed through jungle vegetation, creating a beaten zone that covered all likely approach routes. The Japanese gunner was professional and patient, firing short bursts to conserve ammunition while maintaining suppressive effect. Each burst forced Vlug to seek cover, disrupting his movement and preventing him from establishing stable firing positions. At 55 yards range, Vlug found partial concealment behind a fallen tree trunk and loaded his 5th rocket. The engagement angle was marginal. He could see the Hago's turret and part of its hull, but the shot would be oblique rather than perpendicular. The shape-charge warhead was less effective against angled armor, but his alternatives were limited. Remaining stationary meant eventual detection and destruction by the 37mm gun, while continued maneuvering under machine gun fire increased probability of casualties before he could engage effectively. The Japanese commander had positioned his tank with tactical precision. The wreckage of his destroyed comrade provided frontal protection while limiting his own field of fire to a narrow arc covering Vlug's most likely approach routes. His gunner maintained sight picture on the area where the American soldier had last been visible, ready to engage immediately when target acquisition was achieved. The loader had prepared high-explosive rounds optimized for anti-personnel effect. If they located Vlug's position, the first shot would be decisive. Vlug fired his fifth rocket at 10:19 a.m. The projectile streaked across the gap and struck the Hago's turret at an acute angle, the shape-charged jet deflecting off the curved armor rather than penetrating cleanly. Secondary fragmentation peppered the tank's exterior and cracked several vision blocks, but primary damage was limited. The crew remained combat effective, though temporarily blinded by smoke and debris from the near-miss impact. The tactical situation had reached crisis point. One rocket remaining, one operational enemy tank, marginal engagement geometry, and increasing probability of Japanese reinforcements arriving to investigate the extended firefight. Radio traffic from the destroyed tank column would have alerted higher command that American resistance was heavier than anticipated. Additional armor, infantry, or artillery support could appear within the hour, making Vlug's position untenable regardless of success against the final Hago. The surviving tank commander ordered immediate assault. His driver engaged the transmission and accelerated toward Vlug's last known firing position, accepting the risks of movement in exchange for closing range where his main gun couldn't miss. Machine gun fire swept ahead of the advance, suppressing likely positions while the 37mm gun remained trained on target areas. This was desperate tactics, trading protection for speed, gambling that aggressive movement would overwhelm American anti-tank capability before it could respond effectively. Vlug anticipated the assault and had already begun movement toward a flanking position. His final rocket was loaded as he sprinted between tree clusters, using jungle terrain to mask his displacement from the advancing Hago. The tank's crew was focused on their previous engagement area, expecting return fire from positions Vlug had already abandoned. Their tactical assumption that American anti-tank teams remained stationary created opportunity for final attack from an unexpected angle. The Hago emerged from behind the wreckage at full speed, turret traversing to engage anticipated targets that weren't there. Vlug had positioned himself 40 yards to the south, concealed behind bamboo thickets, that provided visual cover without stopping tank rounds if he was detected. The engagement geometry was optimal perpendicular shot angle at close range against the tank's thinnest side armor. His final rocket would either end the fight decisively or leave him defenseless against 7 tons of enemy armor. At 38 yards, Vlug fired his sixth and final rocket. The shape-charged warhead struck the Hago's side panel just below the turret ring, punching through 9mm of steel and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The copper jet killed 3 crew members instantly, while igniting stored ammunition that cooked off in cascading secondary explosions. The tank careened left, its dead driver's weight pushing the steering controls, before plunging down the steep embankment beside the road. The Hago rolled twice before coming to rest upside down in a ravine 20 feet below road level. Fuel fires spread through the inverted vehicle as ruptured lines fed flames that would consume everything combustible. No movement came from the crew compartment. The impact and secondary explosions had killed anyone who survived the initial rocket strike. Black smoke rose through the jungle canopy, marking the grave of the final tank from the 1st Independent Tank Company's assault on the Ormoc-Lyman roadblock. Silence returned to the jungle at 10:22 a.m. 5 Japanese tanks destroyed in 21 minutes by 1 American soldier with a bazooka and 6 rockets. The roadblock had held, the mission was accomplished, and Japanese reinforcement through this corridor was effectively ended. But Vlug remained exposed in enemy territory with no anti-tank ammunition remaining, and the sound of additional vehicles echoing from the direction of Ormoc Bay. Sergeant Martinez emerged from his position and began coordinating with the surviving squad members. 3 men had been wounded by fragments from Japanese high-explosive shells, but casualties were light considering the intensity of the engagement. The machine gun team reported their weapon was operational and ammunition supply adequate for continued defense. Radio contact with battalion headquarters confirmed that additional American forces were moving forward to reinforce the roadblock and exploit the tactical victory. The immediate tactical problem was resolved, but strategic implications remained unclear. 5 enemy tanks destroyed represented significant degradation of Japanese armored capability on Leyte, but replacement vehicles and crews might already be moving toward American positions. The roadblock would need reinforcement with heavier anti-tank weapons and additional personnel if it was to withstand determined Japanese counterattacks in the coming days. Vlug sat beside his empty bazooka, physically and emotionally drained by 21 minutes of continuous combat against superior numbers. His ammunition was exhausted, his position was compromised, and enemy reinforcements were probable. The tactical victory was complete, but survival remained uncertain in a jungle where Japanese resistance continued, and American support was still hours away from arriving in sufficient strength to guarantee security. The reinforcements arrived at 11:47 a.m. in the form of two M18 Hellcat tank destroyers from the 701st Tank Destroyer Battalion, their crews having heard the sustained gunfire and explosions from 3 miles away. Lieutenant Colonel Bailey himself accompanied the relief column, along with 2 companies of infantry from the 126th Regiment and a forward observer team from the artillery. The scene that greeted them defied immediate comprehension. 5 Japanese tanks destroyed or disabled along a half-mile stretch of jungle road, with minimal American casualties and no evidence of coordinated anti-tank defenses beyond 1 soldier with an empty bazooka tube. Bailey surveyed the wreckage with the professional eye of an officer who had commanded armor operations since Guadalcanal. The tactical geometry told a clear story. Each Hago had been engaged at close range from flanking positions, with every rocket strike achieving decisive penetration against thin Japanese armor. The spacing of destroyed vehicles indicated systematic hunting rather than defensive engagement, with the American anti-tank operator moving aggressively between positions to maintain tactical advantage. Such tactics violated standard doctrine, but had proven devastatingly effective against enemy forces expecting conventional roadblock operations. The intelligence value of the engagement extended far beyond immediate tactical success. 5 Type 95. Hago tanks represented roughly 10% of total Japanese armor strength remaining on Leyte, according to intercepts from the 35th Army's communications. Their destruction at this choke point effectively severed the armored link between Ormoc Bay and inland defensive positions, forcing Japanese commanders to rely on infantry reinforcement through jungle terrain, where American air power could interdict movement with devastating effect. Vlug's after-action report was factual and precise. 6 rockets fired, 5 tanks destroyed, engagement duration 21 minutes, American casualties limited to 3 men with fragment wounds requiring minimal medical attention. He made no attempt to dramatize events or claim credit beyond his specific actions during the armor engagement. The tactical innovation of advancing toward enemy tanks rather than engaging from static positions had emerged from immediate circumstances rather than doctrinal planning, but its effectiveness suggested applications for future anti-tank operations in similar terrain. The strategic implications rippled through command levels, reaching General MacArthur's headquarters in Manila. Japanese armor doctrine in the Pacific had assumed superiority over American infantry anti-tank weapons, particularly in jungle terrain where coordination was difficult and escape routes limited. One soldier's tactical success at the Ormoc-Lyman roadblock challenged fundamental assumptions about the balance between armor and infantry in tropical warfare. Intelligence analysts began reassessing Japanese tank capabilities and recommending increased emphasis on aggressive anti-tank tactics for infantry units. The destruction of the first independent tank company's assault element triggered immediate Japanese response. General Suzuki ordered the second independent tank company to attempt breakthrough at alternate crossing points along the Ormoc corridor, while infantry reinforcements moved to establish defensive positions protecting remaining armor from American anti-tank teams. Radio intercepts indicated growing Japanese awareness that their light tanks were vulnerable to well-handled American bazookas, leading to tactical modifications emphasizing infantry-tank coordination and improved reconnaissance. Within 48 hours, American forces had consolidated control of the Ormoc-Lyman Road junction and established permanent defensive positions anchored by anti-tank guns and reinforced infantry. The roadblock that Vlug had saved became the foundation for sustained American advance toward Ormoc Bay, ultimately contributing to the capture of that critical port facility on December 26th. Japanese resistance on Leyte collapsed systematically as supply lines were severed, and reinforcement became impossible through American-controlled corridors. The personal cost of extended jungle warfare became apparent in following weeks. Lieutenant Colonel Bailey was killed in action on December 19th during operations to expand the American perimeter around Ormoc. Captain Botcher died on December 31st while conducting reconnaissance behind Japanese lines. Sergeant Martinez succumbed to malaria on January 8, 1945, never recovering from illness contracted during the roadblock operations. The casualty rate among officers and senior non-commissioned personnel reflected the intensity of combat and the toll extracted by tropical disease in prolonged campaigns. Vlug remained with his unit through the remainder of the Leyte campaign and subsequent operations on Luzon. His tactical innovation at the roadblock influenced anti-tank training throughout the 32nd Infantry Division, with emphasis on aggressive engagement techniques and individual initiative against enemy armor. Other soldiers began employing similar tactics, advancing toward tanks rather than engaging defensively, using terrain to achieve flanking shots, coordinating movement to exploit enemy blind spots and tactical assumptions. The Medal of Honor recommendation worked through channels with typical military bureaucracy. Initial submission occurred on January 15, 1945, supported by witness statements from surviving squad members and photographic evidence of destroyed Japanese vehicles. Review boards at division, corps, and army levels verified details and confirmed that Vlug's actions met criteria for the nation's highest military decoration. Final approval came from the War Department on March 21, 1946, with presentation ceremony scheduled for June 26 at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. The citation read simply, "He single-handedly attacked and destroyed 5 enemy tanks, which were advancing to break through the roadblock and overwhelm his battalion's defensive position." The understated language reflected military tradition of factual reporting rather than heroic narrative, but colleagues and historians recognized the action's significance for anti-tank warfare development and individual courage under impossible circumstances. Post-war analysis by armor specialists confirmed the tactical revolution represented by Vlug's engagement. Traditional anti-tank doctrine emphasized defensive positioning, coordinated fire, and withdrawal when overwhelmed by superior numbers. The success achieved through aggressive individual action suggested that properly equipped infantry could dominate light armor in suitable terrain, provided tactical leadership was willing to accept risks associated with close-range engagement. These lessons influenced post-war development of infantry anti-tank weapons and tactical doctrine. Vlug returned to Grand Rapids, Michigan in September 1945 and resumed civilian employment as a machinist while remaining active in the Michigan National Guard. He rarely discussed the December morning when 5 Japanese tanks rolled toward his roadblock, and he walked out to meet them with 6 rockets and an idea that conventional wisdom said would get him killed. The tactical principles he had demonstrated, initiative, precision, and willingness to accept calculated risk against superior numbers, became standard instruction for anti-tank teams facing similar circumstances in subsequent conflicts. On June 25, 1996, exactly 50 years after receiving the Medal of Honor, Vlug died quietly in Grand Rapids at age 76. His funeral was attended by veterans from 3 wars who recognized that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what the enemy never expects. The roadblock on the Ormoc-Lyman Road remained a tactical case study, proving that even in the darkest terrain, one soldier with the right tool and the will to act can change what the enemy believed was inevitable.